Shalom Aleichem, everybody. This is Rabbi Sayani. Um, and this is going to be a bit of an interesting class in the sense that it's going to deviate sort of a bit from, the normal model of Parsha, commentary on the Parsha, Chassidut, etc., that kind of model. And what we're going to look at actually is the topic of Giur, Wageris, the topic of conversion. Now, why are we going to look at that topic? Because we're almost at Shavuot. We're almost at the holiday of Shavuos, which, of course, marks really the birth of the Jewish people, in which we all stood, in a sense, like converts on Mount Sinai, right? The whole nation really, in a sense, sort of underwent this process of, a mass gear, a mass conversion, because before that point, we were not really a nation, right? And one of the practices that we have, we don't necessarily do it in our shul, but it is a practice really throughout, the Ashkenazic world, even in some Sephardic, um, communities as well as, they do have a practice of reading what we would consider to be Megillot Ketanot, sort of these minor scrolls or these minor Megillas. Um, the two major ones that everybody reads, of course, are Megillat Esther, which is a requirement, of course, and Eicha, which is a requirement, the Book of Lamentations on Tisha B'Av. But, many do have a custom of reading these minor Megillot, these minor scrolls that are associated with, the holidays, which would be the Book of Ruth on Shavuot, Shir HaShirim, the Song of Solomon, Song of Songs, usually read on Shabbat Chol Hamoed Pesach, as well as Kohelet, the Book of Ecclesiastes, on Shabbat Chol Hamoed Sukkot. Some places even will actually read it from a cloth, will actually read it from a scroll, and they'll make a bracha, which is following the sheet of the Vilna Gaon. But our shul apparently never had the minhag to do that. So I figured, we would not institute that. But the theme of conversion, just due to the birth of the Jewish people, it is very central to the Yom Tov of Shavuot. Right, the moment of Matan Torah, the moment upon which we received the Torah, was marked by sort of a national conversion, punctuated by the acceptance of mitzvot through the declaration that the people made, not sev and nishma, we will do and then we will listen. And to this end, right, there is a custom, of course, to read the book of Ruth in between all of the milchigs, because it chronicles, among other things, the righteous conversion of Ruth. Ruth's conversion, of course, is really the earliest record of a sincere conversion. And we often contrast that with that of the Gibeonites, the Givonim, whose conversion is mentioned in Sefer Yehoshua, right? Right, there is a conversion of the Gibeonites, of the Givonim, that is mentioned in Sefer Yehoshua in the book of Joshua, but that was marked by less than sincere motives, and it does stand in very stark contrast to that of Ruth. And what is Ruth famous for saying in the Megillah? "Vatomer Ruth al tivkei leosvech lashuv me'acharayich ki el asher telichi elechu va'asher telini elina mech ami velokayich elokai." Right? So what is she very famous for saying? Right? It's a very famous declaration that Ruth makes. This is, if you want to follow along, this is in the book of Ruth, chapter 1, verse 16. Very, very beautiful prosaic declaration, entreat me not to leave you. She's talking to Naomi, do not turn back. I will follow you forever. You will go, I will go wherever you dwell. I will dwell for you people. Your people shall be my people, and your God shall be my God. Right? It's very beautiful, right? This is sort of seen as her declaration of joining the Jewish people. Now, the Megillah doesn't make any mention of the rituals that, of course, we know nowadays must accompany a valid conversion to Judaism. We're not necessarily going topic of what we're going to talk about. Um, the rituals are somewhat straightforward, right? And the rituals are not really things that you could really mess up too badly. And what makes this topic different, or this shiur different, this class different, is that this is actually a topic that I'm going to be delivering to rabbinic students. I'm going to be delivering this topic to a kollel in Marlborough, New Jersey, Amir Hashem. The same kollel last year, I actually gave a shiur on the halachot of Chevra Kadisha. They were learning Hilchos Sevelis, they were learning the laws of mourning, how to do funerals, etc. And I taught them basically, what constitutes kosher shmira, kosher tahara, tachrichim, etc. And this year, the Avreichim, Mir Hashem, I'm going to be teaching them this year. We're going to be delving into really the dimensions of, valid conversion in terms of accepting the commandments, accepting the mitzvot, right? What does it mean to accept the mitzvot, Kabbalat ol haMitzvos, which is a very controversial, the most controversial aspect of conversion. And unfortunately, it's something that has really torn the Orthodox world apart. It is extremely contentious in the land in the state of Israel, and I have a lot of personal experience with it. Unfortunately, it is what much of the politics of conversion hinge upon. It is something that rabbis must be very familiar with when deciding whether to accept a conversion as valid. It has to be something we have to be very sensitive about when deciding whether to accept children as Jewish, whether to accept the ketubah as valid. Marrying people, burying people, accepting children. This is a very sensitive and a very wrought topic, unfortunately. But coming back to Ruth, if we look in the Megillah, of course, there is no mention of things like a mikveh, right? Right? We don't see mention of a mikveh. We don't see mention of a beit din. But what we do see, according to the Malbim, right? The Malbim explains. The Malbim is a great commentator. He's an interesting commentator. He's from Romania, and he lived at the time of the Haskalah, and he was Orthodox, but he was also a bit of a maskil in the sense that he was very worldly, very academic as well. But his perush his perushim very interesting. So the Malbim says that when Ruth is saying, your nation is my nation, your God, my God, he says that this is essentially a Kabbalah mitzvot, that she's taking on keeping the mitzvot at this point, and this is her, making a commitment to live as a Jew. Writes the Malbim, he says, Bal tachashov ki tachlicha lichati meshuna, min tachlicha lichatecha sher cholechet l'sham levavor datecha, שתוכל לשמור מצוות התלויות בארץ והתורה והמצווה ואני הולך רך בעבור חסד איזה תועלת. So he's saying that she's taking upon herself, Ruth, to follow, the ways of our religion. That she's taking on mitzvot that are of an agricultural nature, the mitzvot of the land of Israel. She accepted the major tenets of Judaism, the existence of Hashem and His oneness, the unique of the Torah and its customs. That these are the main points of Yiddishkeit that she's accepting, or that she already accepted. כי תכליך הליכתי עצמך התכליך שאת הולכת אליו, וכן אל תחשבי שאני מקווה אזוך הצלחה זמנית, שנעשה לאיש עשיר וכדומה, כי באשר תליני אלין, אלין כגר בארץ וכזדיקים שעולם חזך, ואצלם רק כמלון אורחים, כי בגבר חליכתך ומצד כאמך עמי ואלוקייך אלוקי, שכבר תפסתי תורת אלוקיך, ומנחגי בני עמך, ואני כאחד מבני עמך. that her desire is to die the death of tzaddikim. Um, that her desire is to live according to these practical mitzvot. And that these are the things really that, and in reality, these are the things really that are essential for a person to convert even nowadays, that they have to express a belief in, right? A belief in the eternity of the neshama, schar v'onesh, reward and punishment, belief in olam haba, the world to come, techiyah hametim, resurrection of the dead. These are the basic Ikari Ha'emunah, the basic principles and premises of Judaism. So, according to the Malbim, Ruth is giving us an example of what it means to basically makabel al haMitzvot. And so, when talking about gear, when talking about conversion, in preparation for Shavuot, to look at the role of really what Kabbalah al haMitzvot means, I think would be a very apropos topic. And again, the controversy with conversion depends on it because it is extremely subjective, right? Who's kosher to sit on a beit din is a relatively objective halacha, right? A witness in halacha, we know who a kosher witness is. Those of us in the congregation, not going to mention names, have more practical experience in that area than others. That's a funny story. Those, Hamev and Yavin, those of us know the story, know the story. But a kosher witness is a kosher witness, a kosher mikveh is a kosher mikveh, a kosher bris is a kosher bris, right? There's not too much controversy, but what it means to accept the mitzvot as part of a conversion, this is very controversial. Before we continue with the shiur, we want to say that this should be for the sake of a refuah shlema, for Choli Yisrael, especially Chaya Bas Sipora, for Yidlei Bas Freidel, for Eliyahu ben Kela, for Shlomo Halevi ben Chana, for Shana Fega Bas Rivka. It should also be the Uli Nishmas Necha Bas Herschel. We say Hashem Yibach Tamidu Chavoti, that we should all feel the love of a Kadosh Baruch Hu, that Toch Choli Yisrael should have a refuah shlema, that everybody should find their zivug. Tikva Bas Tamar Aviva, or Mispal Sapor Yocheved Bas Yalchana, for Shlema for Mordechai ben Esther. And I pray also that there should be, you should also be Mispal myself, Daniel Gabriel ben Sarah as well. So, continuing, so this has also become a very big issue nowadays because there is a concern people converting for ulterior motives. There is a mitzvah, of course, to love and accept converts, right? It's a very serious sin in the Torah to cause converts any grief, to not love the convert. It's actually the most repeated commandment in the Torah. It's repeated actually 36 times. Some commentaries would say as many as 46. So it's a very serious issue actually. So keeping that in mind, that's why this is an issue that has to be very delicately discussed, and I think rabbis are very aware of that. So we certainly do not want to reject people unnecessarily. On the other hand, there is an ulterior motive nowadays, right? People did not want to be Jewish for much of history. Nowadays, the ulterior motive is immigration to Israel, specifically also by way of marriage. A unique issue we deal with nowadays, I wouldn't necessarily say it's an ulterior motive, but it's a motive of identity. We have people with Jewish fathers and non-Jewish mothers. And there is a very respected chain of tradition. We were talking about this actually last Shabbos in the drasha, right? In my drasha, I was talking about the case of the Makalkel, the case of the blasphemer in the Torah, who we know through Midrash that his father was actually the Egyptian who Moshe Rabbeinu killed, right? He was the Egyptian that lifted his hand up to Moshe Rabbeinu. His mother was Jewish with ancestry through Shevet Dan, through the tribe of Dan. And he was somebody. He was what we would call a matrilineal Jew. Really, nowadays he would be considered a Jew l'chol davar, a Jew by all counts, because his mother was Jewish. Um, the Taurus Kahanim, the Sifra, right, that great halachic midrash on the book of Vayikra, tells us that he actually went through a gerus process, that he went through Mila and Mikveh to try to really become fully accepted as Jewish. And what's interesting about that is, and we see a line of reasoning that follows even through Tosfos and even through Shuvas of Shlomo Kluger, right, and even through Achronim, even through later authorities, we see actually that people with Jewish mothers and non-Jewish fathers were not necessarily accepted as Jews fully. And there's also a line of reasoning that says that if a person has a Jewish father and a non-Jewish mother, they should be really given a very expedited conversion because we want to bring them into the fold. There's a reason to want to make them Jewish, right? We don't doubt their motivation, whereas people who just are fully non-Jewish, we realize that you do not have to be Jewish to be loved by God and to have the keys to the kingdom, so to speak, right? We don't necessarily, feel that the world needs to be Jewish. We're very tolerant in the sense that we believe that all people, have a purpose and God loves them and can have a relationship with the Kadosh Baruch Hu. So um, I will say also, just as a matter of practicality, when people do come to convert, and you all know that that's one of the things that I do is I do mentor and I do teach people that are interested in becoming Jewish. Um, if they're not going to be observant at first, it's not necessarily a reason that I won't teach them, but certainly I do explain to them that if there is going to be a finalized conversion, Beit Din, we're not going to send them to the Beit Din, for conversion, if they're not there yet. So, if a ger does agree to fulfill the mitzvahs properly, um, let's say, but they don't lead a religious lifestyle following the conversion, is the conversion valid? We're going to see generally that the answer is yes. We're going to look at one specific source. We're going to talk a lot about Rav Chaim Moshe Grudzinski Zatzal, the Achiezer, and we'll see how that works. But generally, a responsible Beit Din, we convert people really going in with the knowledge that this is the intention. What it really all depends on is what is the intention at the time of conversion. We prepare people, we convert people in a situation where this will be the case. Nobody has, we're going to see that a lot of this really just depends on good judgment, right? Nobody has, nobody could read into the future. It's not feasible, and Hashem doesn't expect that of us. It's really just going on, reasonable assumption. So, um, the discussion begins really with the understanding that, in the first place, acceptance of the Torah and the mitzvot as part of the conversion process, it is seemingly very much essential, right? It would be incongruous. It wouldn't make sense if it were not to be essential. So we're going to look at Maseches Bechoros Daf Lamed on the base, where the Gemara says, Tana Rabbanim, Abel kabel divrei chaverus michutz midavar echad ein mekablin oso. Goy shebel kabel divrei Torah chutz midavar echad ein mekablin oso. Rabbi Yosef, Rabbi Yehuda Omer, filu diktuk echad midivrei sofrim. So the sages taught in the Brisa, in the case of a person who comes to accept upon himself the commitment to observe matters associated with the status of chaver, except for one matter. We're going to explain what that means in a moment. What is a chaver? Um, so if he wants to, so the idea is the person wants to take upon himself a commitment to have this special status of being a chaver. So the word chaver in Hebrew literally means friend, but that's not what we're talking about here. This is a special status conferred upon certain special people. So he wants the status, and he's willing to do everything just except for one thing. They don't accept him, and he's not considered to be relied upon and trustworthy, even with regard to those matters that he does wish to take upon himself. So this Gemara, this becomes very significant actually in a whole other context, and this is a whole other class, but this becomes very significant actually with the discussion of, let's say if people keep a kosher home, and they're very careful to buy only kosher food and so forth, but they don't observe Shabbat. Can you rely upon them, right? So it's basically saying, if people are relied upon in one area, but they don't keep another area, can you trust them in the other area? And the answer is generally no, by the way, because keeping Shabbat is generally considered the barometer by which you trust people for all ritual matters. But Reb Moshe Feinstein, Nigros Moshe, he deals with this, and there actually are exceptions. It's not so easy, but I'm not going to digress. So looking at this same case, the Gemara sort of makes an analogy to the case of a non-Jew who he comes to convert. And it says they're willing to take upon themselves the words of the Torah except for one. So, we've dealt with people like this where, they like what Judaism has to say. They're willing to accept things, but they have a problem with one thing here or one thing there. And according to the Gemara, they can't be accepted. It says if they take upon themselves to accept the words of the Torah except for one matter, they cannot be accepted as a convert. Even if they refuse to accept one detail of rabbinic law, they can't be accepted. So, listen, it's a rabbinic law that says that women cannot be counted as a minion, that women cannot be counted for a minion, right? What makes it a rabbinic law? It's in the Gemara. You could open up a Steinsaltz or an Art Scroll and find it right there, right? It's, to say that we can't say Kaddish if I have 9 men in the room, one goes out to the bathroom, to say that I have to resume to wait for somebody to come back. That's a rabbinic law. If a person wanted to convert, but they object to that, I can't convert them according to this. Because, if they object to even one rabbinic matter, I cannot convert them because they are rejecting one aspect of God's law, of God's word. Now, just as sort of an educational point, divrei chaverus, what do we mean by that? So this is on line 4 in the Gemara on the date. It's referring to an interesting matter. So who were the chaverim, by the way? These were people that kept certain laws properly. They were sort of like it was sort of like an elite club of people who actually took upon themselves to be specific and in terms of very far agricultural mitzvahs. So in that society, to be an am haaretz, to be an ignoramus, was a specific, or to have the category, I should say, of just we call an am haaretz an ignoramus, but really it had a very specific connotation. It was not necessarily a good thing to be an am haaretz from the Galil. And so a chaver would never give them he would never give them truman maestro, would never give an am haaretz, sort of those tithes and offerings. They would never prepare taharot, matters of purity in the vicinity of an am haaretz. They would always eat their chulin b'tahara. They would always eat their ordinary food in a state of ritual purity. The closest thing we have, believe it or not, that sort of eating practice, there actually is a remnant nowadays, according to Rishonim, that we still do keep, believe it or not. And that is the practice to eat Pat Yisrael during the Aseret Yemei Teshuvah, to only eat special bread, made in an oven ignited by a Jew during the 10 days of repentance between Rosh Hashanah and Kippur. It's believed that practice, that halacha was actually a holdover from this. And also to take maser from all produce that one eats, sells, and buys. Not necessarily required, but it was a stringency that these special chaverim would take on. None of which we keep nowadays, but these were the chaverim back then. So we learned from these special practices that a convert who has a problem, they object, to any of what the Torah says, any of the Torah's mitzvot. They declare outright they're not going to keep them. They can't be accepted. They have to be like Ruth. They have to accept everything without exception. They have to have a naseh v'nishma attitude, and that's that. Now, in a case where a prospective convert, let's say genuinely and sincerely, they accept upon themselves to adhere to the Torah mitzvahs, meaning philosophically, in principle, they accept everything, right? They don't have a problem with anything, but they just know that they're going to be lazy. They know that they're going to succumb on occasion, they're going to succumb to the eight Sahara. So if a person comes and converts, you're convinced that they really believe that they're going to be religious, but the person inside his heart, he knows down the road, that I believe in this, I love this, but I know I'm going to be lazy, I'm going to cheat, I'm going to eat this, I'm not going to keep Shabbos fully, whatever. That doesn't invalidate the conversion, actually. And this is really the understanding of the Achiezer. And I see the Achiezer really as, I see the Achiezer, it's more of a contemporary source, but I think that this is really one of the main ones that we're going to be dealing with on the subject. He says that if a person accepts all of the mitzvahs in principle, but if he intends to break one of them intentionally, it's not a lack of Kabbolas and mitzvahs. That there's a difference between Kabbolas and mitzvahs, accepting the mitzvahs in principle before the Beis Din, and the reality that there is a human fallibility and that people are not perfect. And he says that that is not a chisaron, that's not a lacking in Kabbalah Solam mitzvahs. He says very clearly, "Aval b'mishim b'kabel of kol mitzvot, rak shebedato lavor l'te'avon, ein ze chisaron b'din Kabbalah mitzvot." So let's look at the broader context of the teshuva. So he's dealing with really converting non-Jewish spouses. And this was written back in the winter of 1911 to 1912. So he was asked regarding a Jewish man who returned to Europe from America, and he was in a civil marriage with a non-Jewish woman. And they were threatening to do a reform conversion if they could not get an Orthodox Beis Din to do a gerus for the non-Jewish woman. So it was very clear that this was a case of a gir l'shem ishus, that this was a conversion for the sake of marriage. And also, the woman would not necessarily be keeping anything after marriage, right? They were not an observant couple necessarily, or maybe they were just putting on an act to try to get the conversion done. Now, as an aside, there's actually a question, and it's a discussion. There is a question whether this couple would even be allowed to be married. Right. So if you have, and it's a very big discussion, and it's discussed all the way as far back as the Mishnah in the Masechet Yevamot Daf Chof Daled Amud Beit. If you had a couple, Jewish, non-Jewish, they're cohabitating, the non-Jewish partner was converted, can they then subsequently be married Jewishly and live happily ever after? Shalom al Yisrael. Now, the Mishnah seems to prohibit marriage in these cases. Right, the Mishnah says as follows. It says, "Hanita al shivcha v'nishtachvira, o goya v'nitgaira, harei ze lo yichnos v'im knas ein motzi miyado. Hanitan al eshed ish v'chziucha mitachet yado af al pi shekanas yotzi." So it says, one suspected by others of engaging in relations with Canaanite shevcha maid servant, and let's say they later freed her, or if one was suspected of even just having relations with any non-Jewish woman and they subsequently converted her, it says that he may not marry that woman because it'll strengthen the suspicions against him. But if he did marry her, the Beis Din will not require them to get divorced. So it's really like not the best thing, but it's more like a b'diavad. It's like an after the fact kind of situation. With regard to a person who is suspected of having illicit relations with a married woman, though, the Beis Din will force a divorce, even if the man suspected of the illicit relations would subsequently marry, and even if the man suspected of these relations, subsequently married her, he has to divorce her. And the Gemara explains the reason for this prohibition. The Gemara says, Urmini, Echadish Nidgayer L'Shumish, Vechadish Nidgayer L'Shumish, Vechein Mish Nidgayer, L'Shum Shulchan Melochim, L'Shum Avdei Shlomo, Ein and Gerim, Divrei Rabbi Nechemia. So the Mishnah teaches that a person who's suspected of relations with a Goya, a Gentile woman who later converted, may never marry her, which would imply that she is a Gioris, although it appears that she converted only in order that he would marry her. Now, the Gemara brings there's a contradiction from a brisa. So both the man who converted for the sake of a woman, which doesn't really happen, to be honest. That's, it's interesting. The Gemara, especially the Rambam, talks about that. But, perhaps maybe back then that was the reality. Nowadays, that's extremely not the case. Very, very rarely is that the case. And statistically, you could speak, it's very interesting. Religious conversion in general, not even by Jews, but just in general, boundary crossers, religious boundary crossers in general, it's mostly women. Women are inherently more spiritually interested than men are. In terms of, Jewish conversion, we'll look at it sort of as I'll speak of America at least. Sociologically in America, we know statistics from the AJC, the American Jewish Committee. I'm a member of their Rabbis Roundtable. That's how I have these statistics. I believe about 81% of converts to Jewish denominations in America across the board are women. Statistics from the Rabbinical Council of America, which represents the RCA. The RCA is basically Yeshiva University's rabbinic organization. 78% of their converts are women. 78% of their converts are women, and approximately 66% of whom are in relationships with modern Orthodox young men. So the vast majority of those doing conversion to Judaism are women. I believe in Israel, the statistics are probably similar through the Rabbanut. The program where I teach, a very good number of the students are women who are in civil marriages or in relationships with Israelis, actually, as well. Very interesting. So yeah, men doing conversion, it's not such a common thing anyway. Doing it to marry a woman, it's rare. I'm sure it happens, but I think it's very rare. So the Gemara says that you would have these men who would convert for the sake of a woman, or they would convert. What does it mean that they would convert? L'shum shulchan malachim, convert for the sake of the king's table, so they could get jobs, serve in a prestigious capacity, or for the sake of Solomon's servants, for prestige, basically. In all of these cases, it seems like there is some sort of an ulterior motive. They're not Einan Gerim, they're not converts. This is the statement of Rabbi Nechemia. This is what Rabbi Nechemia said. Shachai Rabbi Nechemia Omer, what would Rabbi Nechemia say? Echad Geri Arayot, ve'echad Geri Chalomot, ve'echad Geri Mordechai ve'Esther, Einan Gerim, Eid Sheyit Gairu Bisman Hazeh. Very interesting categories of converts. Converts by lions, basically people who would convert under duress, such as the Kutim. So what do we mean by the Kutim? So Samaritans were Kutim. They were forced to convert under duress. So, second book of Kings, chapter 17, verses 24 through 25. If you'd like to look it up, you could see what we're talking about there. Converts who convert based on their dreams, basically, you get a lot of people like this. These are people who don't understand that we're a religion of reason. It's very interesting. There was a book called Shiloh to Tshuva Min HaShamayim that came out that was released in the Middle Ages. Allegedly, it was a book of response based on revelations from heaven. There's a tradition of kind of such, revelation from above, dreams, that kind of thing. Um, there is a tradition of such kind of supernatural experience, spiritual, paranormal kind of thing in Judaism. We're not generally in favor of it, though, and Bava Metzia daf 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 Bava Metzia daf excuse me, Bava Metzia daf the Peg Test Summit Base, the famous story of the Toner Shalachnai, Achnai Zoven, right? Well, Bashamayim, we don't make decisions by a bas kol, by a heavenly message, by what we hear in an extrasensory sense, or in a or in a magical sense, or anything like that, right? We have a system and a process that is very clearly laid down in the Torah, right? That you have a written Torah and you have rabbinic authority, as God tells us in the 17th chapter of the book of Deuteronomy, and that's how you do it. So, people that do things in a wackadoo way, like what Rabbi Nehemiah is talking about, we reject those people. Um, Converts from the time of Mordechai and Esther. So the Megillah says that again, people converted under duress because they were afraid, right? In Megillah chapter 8, verse 17, it says that people were afraid because they saw what had happened in Shushan, and people in the vicinity, they were afraid. They were afraid, so they converted out of duress. These were not sincere conversions. It says, they're not considered converts until they convert again at the present time. They would have to show sincerity to do a valid conversion. That would not be under a state of ones. That would not be under a state of duress. So, and this is why, when the Jewish people are in a state of exile and there's really no material benefit to conversion, we're more likely to accept converts. But, when we're flying high, when we're on top, and when we're concerned that people will do this for the wrong reasons, there's less of a reason to do it. Unfortunately, we do have a community, the Syrian community, where there are people in the community that are very observant. Most of them, I would say, are more on the traditional side. Um, they don't accept converts, and the reason is because they're very wealthy. And I don't think they'll ever admit this to anybody. I don't think they ever will admit that, but the reason why they passed the ban against converts was because they're very concerned about their money leaking into the community, and they have a paranoia that people will want to convert into their community because they see how they live. And you go down to Deal, New Jersey, and I've done so. And I've met very, very lovely, sincere people from that community. I do not hold it against them. Um, you know, I've even gone into their synagogues and prayed and have benefited from very nice meals in their synagogues. But I don't hold it against any of them or their rabbanim. But this rule was made largely, I believe, to for motivations of protecting money. And if you look at how they live, it's understandable. You go down to Deal, New Jersey, you look at their houses, they have private security. You go to Ocean Parkway in Brooklyn, they're very well off. And, listen, Hashem should bless them. If they use their money for good reasons, and, if they support good Jewish causes and good things in the world, Hashem should bless them. So Gemara continues. So returning to the question above, if a woman who converted for the sake of a man, how can she be considered a true convert? And the Gemara answers, wasn't it stated with regard to the Brisa that Rav Yitzchak Bar Shmuel Bar Martha said of the name of Rav that the halacha is like, it's like the Mandamar who says that they're all converts. I chachi lechatchila name yishum de Ravasi dama Ravasi hasemi mecha ikshut pei uzutzvayim v'chulei. The Gemara asks, if so, why is a person who's, if we're chashed, if we're suspected, person is chashed of having snus with such a woman, if so, why is he not allowed to have marriage with her lechatchila as well in the first place? And the Gemara says that the reason for the isser, the reason for the prohibition, is because of what Ravasi says. And Ravasi says, he brings this as a pasuk from Mishlei. It's Parak Daled Pasuk Chof Daled in Mishlei. That you know, to keep a twisted mouth and perverted lips far away from you, meaning that if you were to allow it, it would create actually. It would just create too much bad talk. It would give substance to the prior suspicions. And the truth is actually, and this is where it gets important. If you were allowed them to marry, and this is an important thing to keep in mind. So you convert somebody, you convert the woman, you're creating a situation where the woman is they're going to speak bad about her. And that creates a situation where you're automatically, you're automatically having a case of where people are speaking bad about a convert to Judaism. Automatically 3646 Yisuri Deraisa, 3646 Torah prohibitions. Right, so Rashi here says that we're concerned that the initial rumor regarding we're concerned that the initial rumor regarding the relationship was true, and that's why there would be hesitation to do the gerus. Right, Rashi says Lo Yishana Yishum Laz Shelo Yomer Hakol Rishon, that maybe the prior suspicions were true. The Rashba, on the other hand, says that we fear that people may think that she only converted due to their illicit relationship. It would be bad for her. He says they were worried that people will talk and say that she would result in not such a good situation. Ebenezer Simon Yudalev Seif Hey Paskins. He says Anita Mishpacha v'nochrit v'nitgaira v'nishtach lo yichnois ve'im kanas lo yotzi. That if one is accused of sleeping with a maid servant or goya, and then she converts or she's freed, he still cannot marry her. But if he already married her, he doesn't have to divorce her. So Chaim Krasinski is dealing with that. The gerus was done for snus, for not such married. So let's relate it back to Mustaf Chav Dalit on the base. They had a machlokus, they had a dispute regarding whether a gerus done l'shem ishus for the sake of marriage was valid or not, whether it was chal. The Chemya says that a gerus done for personal benefit as well as one done unto ones for coercive. The Gemara is like the Manda Amar says that they're all converts, that the conversions are all valid. So from where do we get this machlokus, this fundamental debate between Reb Nechemia and the Chachamim? And we're going to see that according to the Achiezer, he says that all agree that really the foundation of gerus has to do with intention, and that a conversion, a gerus, it has to be done b'leiv shalom, it has to be done wholeheartedly, and that what the machlokus has to do with, what they're disagreeing about, is as to whether we have to assume that one who is Megayer for an ulterior motive did not wholeheartedly convert. So he says, he's saying that according to Reb Nechemia, gerus is not like other legal acts, not like other things in halacha, have to be done b'leiv shalom, because the Kabbolas and haMitzvos itself, and the gerus, it's done really, it's an internal thing. It's done within one's heart. If a person is doing it without a full heart, he's not really considered to be a true ger, true convert. So the Chacham, though, in contrast to Reb Nehemiah, they say that one's primary motivation for conversion, it doesn't necessarily impact upon his ability to accept upon himself to fulfill the mitzvahs. So, in the absence of overwhelming circumstantial evidence, which we call in halacha, which we would call in halacha an umdana demuk, an umdana demukach, uh, you know, if we don't have an umdana demukach, overwhelming circumstantial evidence that he was Megayer l'shem ishus for the sake of marriage, at best his status would be a suffix. But he agrees, according to the Achiezer, that it would be invalid. Reb Nechemia, though, holds that unless it's clear that the gerus was for the proper reasons, it would be possible, it would be invalid. While the Chachamim hold that the gerus is recognized to be suffix out of doubt, unless the true reason were to become evident. So, um, the Shut Achiezer, this is in Chelik Gimel, very famous Shut responsum, as we would say in English, Chafsain. So again, his fundamental position is that the conversion would not be valid only where a person explicitly refuses to accept one of the mitzvot. But by contrast, where there is merely a concern that he might not keep all of the mitzvot after the conversion, but he never actually declared such an intention, the conversion is good. And since such a convert genuinely accepts the mitzvot upon himself, he acknowledges that he's bound to keep them. It's valid, even if he knows at the time of the conversion that he's going to slip up, that he has human weakness, and he's going to succumb to the Yetzer Hara. But the conversion is valid only if there is an absolute intention to uphold the basic tenets of the Torah. But he realizes that occasionally he'll fail in some specific regard just due to his human weaknesses. But if he plans in advance to transgress any basic tenet of the Torah, such as Shabbat or Kashrut, on a consistent basis, that is not going to be considered a Kabbalah of mitzvot, a true acceptance of the mitzvot, and the conversion would not be valid. So Achiezer says, he says, near the din said the nikri Shabbat hikayer l'Kabbalah of kol mitzvot chutz midituk echad midituk sofrim de'ein mekablin oto. Chaynu b'matan shelo l'kabel v'sheyachim mutar lo devar ze min hadin. וזה אין מקבלין אותו דאין שיעור בגירות ואין גירות לחצאין, אבל במי שמקבל עליו כל המצוות רק שבדתו לעבוד לתיאבון, אין זה חיסרון בדין קבלת המצוות. So he says that it seems that this halacha, that we don't accept the guy who comes to convert and accept all of the mitzvahs upon himself, except for one din d'Rabbanan, except for one rabbinic law, that this applies only where he stipulates that he does not accept this law, and that it should be permitted to him according to halacha. In such a case, he says, the Achiezer, we don't accept him because there are no omissions or conditions regarding gerus, and there's no such thing as a half conversion. However, one who accepts all of the mitzvahs, but intends to transgress just due to his weaknesses, due to his physical desires, it's not considered a lacking in his acceptance of mitzvahs. So, again, if a person comes to the Beis Din, he's sincere, but, he knows that he never shook a taste for a Big Mac, and he knows every now and then he may want to go and have one. It's not considered a problem according to the Achiezer because it's merely human weakness. It's not considered a deficiency for the mitzvahs because he's merely human, and it's te'avon. It's that Nevertheless, he adds that when it is clear that he does not plan to fulfill the mitzvahs, it is considered as if he had stated so explicitly. So continues the Achiezer. He says, "Ulam checha shebarach hadavar shebavad yavor, achrei chen al isur torach chil shabbat vechil trefod, ve'eno yodim bevor kavanat she'eno mitgaya rak lefanim v'libo balimo. Hare umdana demuchach shema she'om shemakabel levan mitzvot, lav klum lav klum, hu im kein bzechu chisron bekabelat mitzvot demerchav." Right. So again, this concept of an umdana demuchach. So he says that when it is clear that a person will certainly transgress Torah prohibitions afterward, like we know he's going to be a Mechal Shabbos, he's going to eat non-kosher, right? We know for certain that his intentions are to convert outwardly alone, but we know that he's insincere. Literally, he writes, means his heart is not with him. He says this is considered a clear assessment that when he accepts the mitzvahs upon himself, this is meaningless. And this is indeed considered to be a lacking in his acceptance of mitzvahs that would invalidate the conversion. And in such a case, the Achiezer would say that this is not a true conversion. Now, what's interesting is that when the Achiezer talks about the fact that if a person is, when he says "Rakshe," when he talks about this being the case, that if a person is transgressing, when he says that if a person is transgressing the te'avon in such a way that this is not considered chisaron in Kabbolas haMitzvos, this is actually paralleled by a comment that the Ramban makes, believe it or not, on a pasuk in Parshas Kisavo. So on Parshas Kisavo, the Ramban, the pasuk in Kisavo is Ara asher lo yakim et divrei Torah zola suratam v'amar kol ha'am amen. Cursed is he who will not uphold the Torah to perform it. The Ramban has an interesting comment there. The Ramban says as follows. He says, "Ulefi daiti ki hakabbalah hazot sheyodei b'mitzvot, believe v'yu be'enav emet, בימין שעושה אותן יהיה לו שכר וטובה, והאויבר עליכן יעניש, ואם יכפור באחת מכן לא תהיה, ואינה בטלה לעולם, הנה ערר. אבל אם עבר על אחת מכן כגון שאכל חזיר וחשקת לתאוותו שלא עשה סוכה ולא לבצלה, אינו בחרם חזה, כי לא אמר הכתוב אשר לא יעשה דברי התורה הזאת, אלא אמר אשר לא יקים את דברי התורה הזאת לעשות, so he says, the Ramban, fundamentally, that you have a difference between accepting the Torah and subsequently falling into laziness and non-observance. Right, the Ramban is sort of paralleling what the Achiezer says, that you have a difference really between sort of just laziness or human frailty and again, sort of like a more philosophical or spiteful rejection. Right? That's essentially what the Ramban is saying, that so the Ramban is basically saying here, if you have a person who, if he's transgressing a mitzvah in the Torah, such as, let's say, eating chazir or sheket, something abominable out of desire, or if he's not making a sukkah, or if he's not taking a lulav because of laziness and sukkahs, it says that the sort of cherem that the Torah is describing here in this, the Tochach and Kisavo, he's not included because the Torah is not saying a person who's not doing what the Torah says, right? So the Ramban, so if you just have a Jew, let's say, who's not observant because he's lazy or he doesn't know, but he says that the Torah is not cursing those who are not performing the words of the law, but meaning those that are confirming not the words of the Torah to do them, meaning like those that are making a rejection of it. So there's a difference between laziness, he's saying, and a person denying the validity of a mitzvah. And there's a very big difference, the Ramban is saying, between a person rejecting the validity of a mitzvah and just not doing it because he's lazy. And he says a person could be, a person could sin because of his lusts, just out of laziness, but he could still accept the Torah as true. And he's still considered as a person who's blessed because he's upholding the words of the Torah, and the tochach here, the curse, is not applying to him, which is very interesting. Um, and Reb Moshe, actually, Reb Moshe has several tshuvas on Gerus, especially Kabbolas mitzvahs, which became a very big thing in Reb Moshe's day because, Reb Moshe's major thing was really dealing with the struggles of the conservative movement in the 50s. Um, and, the conservative movement back then, I would think generally with the exception of Kabbalas mitzvahs, they performed their conversions with, kosher means. Um, no, nevertheless, he is in full agreement, the way Rav Moshe learns the Gemara, that a person cannot be Megayer, they can't convert if they are denying even one mitzvah. So take a look at Rav Moshe. This is in Yoredeya, Chelik Beis, Dalet. Which says the Hager Shelo Kibel Af Diktuk Echad Ein Makablin Oto Ita Bif Chorot Daf Lamed Umashma Shagam Kish Kiblu Oto Eno Ger Bidlo Huskar Shabediavid Hu Ger. So he says, Reb Moshe, that we don't accept a person who doesn't accept upon himself even one af dituk achad. It has to even one detailed derabbanan, even one rabbinic detail as a ger, as brought in our Gemara in Becharos Taf Lamed Amud Beis. And it seems that even if the Bezdin accepted him as a convert, even if the Bezdin were to accept him as a ger, it's not a valid gerus because it doesn't state in the Gemara that this would be considered to be a kosher gerus, even b'diavad. And some actually see proof of what Rav Moshe is saying from the words of the Shulchan Aruch. Now, what's very interesting is the Shulchan Aruch seems to have actually two contradictory positions. Is it a contradiction? Is it not? We're going to see that play out. So some would see in the Shulchan Aruch, at least in one place in the Shulchan Aruch, that Kabbalas mitzvahs, that a full acceptance of the mitzvahs is essential, that accepting the mitzvahs is critical, and that not doing so would invalidate the gerus if not done properly. So they would see this position in. So the Shulchan Aruch discusses gerus in Yoredeya Reish Samach. In Seif Gimel, we could see some basis in the Shulchan Aruch for the Shita that Kabbalas mitzvahs might be essential. Says the Shulchan Aruch, Kol Inyan Yiger Bein Leodia mitzvahs Lekablam Bein Hamila Bein Atvila Zarich Sheyu Begimel Kesharim Ladona V'Yom Mihu Davka Lechatchil Laval B'Diavad Im Lamal Taval Ela Bifnei Beis Okrovim Uvlayla Filu Taval L'Shem Gerus Ela Isha Taval L'Krova Isha Shtaval L'Nadata L'Geramuta B'Yisraelis Chutz B'Kabal HaMitzvot Sheme'akevet Im Eina Bayom V'Shlosha. Says the Shulchan Aruch that all matters pertaining to the ger, including, so it seems to be this concept of a Shulchan Aruch says a haMitzvos, like informing them of the mitzvahs, doesn't the haMitzvos the kabbalam informing him of the mitzvot that he must accept. It sounds like this concept of a Kabbolas mitzvahs, that the Beis Din has to tell him of the commandments of the mitzvahs that he has to take upon himself, that there has to be milah, that there has to be mikveh, tevila, that it has to be with a kosher Beis Din. And Beis Din, of course, only operates during the daytime. Shulchan Aruch says, though, but this is all the way to do it lechatchila, initially, but after the fact, let's say you didn't do it this way in the first place. He says, but yeah, but after the fact, let's say you didn't do it the right way. You only had two rather than three, or if you didn't have a kosher Beis Din, right? You didn't have kosher witnesses. You had the convert's relative, Jewish relatives involved, right? Interesting, right? It says in front of the convert's relatives. So very interesting. The Shulchan Aruch had the semblance that maybe you had, right? I didn't actually ever think of this before. I'm just reading it and thinking of it now. You know, that maybe you did have some kind of intermarriage back then where you had, people converting to Judaism with observant Jewish relatives who were able to be a Beis Din for them. They were ignorant at night. You can't have a Beis Din at night. Or maybe the immersion was not done, maybe he's in the process of converting and he did it for the sake of he wants to keep Tevilas Ezra, or the woman is doing it because she wants to practice Taharas Mishpacha. Whatever these reasons are, the Shulchan Aruch says that these um, that these are considered to be valid conversions, and they could even go and marry Jews. But Kabbolas haMitzvos, except regarding accepting the mitzvahs, chutz mi Kabbalat haMitzvot shebekevet im einam that for that you need the Beis Din to be a kosher one. That it has to be done during the day, and for that you need a Beis Din of three. Now the issue is that this seems to contradict another another ruling in the Shulchan Aruch, which would seem that not, and this is a psak in the Shulchan Aruch that cites the Nimukei Yosef, which would seem to say that not informing the potential ger about the mitzvahs that they have to keep would not render the gerus invalid after the fact. This is in Seif Yud Beis. So you see two different ideas brought in the Shulchan Aruch. And there, the basis of this opinion of this psak of the Shulchan Aruch comes from the Rambam in Hilchos Yisur Bia Perek Gimel Halacha Yud Zayin. There, the Rambam says, "Ger shelo v'dak lacharav, o shelo v'diyuchu haMitzvot v'anashan umal v'taval bifnei shlosha hedyotot charei ze ger." The Rambam says that when the Beis Din didn't do a very good job, they didn't check his background. They didn't tell him of any of the mitzvot. They didn't tell him of the punishment of the failure to keep the mitzvot. And it says that, let's say he even gave himself a bris milah, and he immersed, he toiveled in the presence of just three ordinary Jews. It says, Hari Zeger, he's a kosher convert. If you know there should be shvil devar mitkayer, choil umal v'taval, yatzim miklal goyim, v'choshishim lo ad sheyitpaer zitkoto. Even if it is discovered that he was Magaya for an ulterior motive, since he gave himself a meal and he converted, he is no longer in the category of the goyim. And it says, he's Jewish, but we view him with skepticism until he reveals his righteousness. So, it's interesting. Like, we go from that to just a very complex and convoluted system nowadays. But imagine that at Beis Din, they don't bother to check his background and they don't tell him of any of the mitzvahs. There's actually a case, if you could imagine, the Gemara Masechet Shabbat, Daf Samachet Amud Beit, 68b. Gemara talks about a person who was converted and they didn't even tell him about Shabbat, the most important fundamental mitzvah of the Jewish people. A person who was converted, he didn't know about Shabbat, and it's a valid conversion. Um, the Bach, who we'll see on Seif Yud Beis in the Shulchan Aruch, is also seemingly very clear that when there was no Kabbolas and mitzvahs, the gerus would be valid after the fact, the Diavad, according to this Rambam. That if the ger was not makabel the mitzvah, says the Bach, kasher afal pi shelo chaya l'shem kabbalat haMitzvot kol ikar. It's a good conversion. So the Shulchan Aruch, we'll see in Mechaber in Seif Yud Beis, when bringing this Rambam, he changes the girsi, changes the text to schar mitzvot, reward for the mitzvot. Yes, schar mitzvot. He changes the text to that, implying that the guy has to still accept the mitzvot before tefillah, which we'll see here. So says the Shulchan Aruch. If he knows ויתקייחו ומל ותבל יצא מכלל עובדי כל חבים וחוששים לו עד שתתברר צדקתו ואפילו חזר ועד אלילים הרי הוא כישראל מומר שקידושיו קידושים. So here it's very clear that the Mechaber is bringing our Rambam almost word for word. So yeah, the Shulchan Aruch says that if the Bezdin didn't investigate the ger, they didn't tell him of the reward for fulfilling the mitzvahs or the punishment for transgressing them, all of which the Gemara in Maseches Yevamos Daf Mem Zayin base says the Bezdin has to do. And Shulchan Aruch says, and if he had a milah, he was circumcised, and he went in a mikveh before three ordinary people. Hedyotot means ordinary people, meaning that they're not rabbis. It's a kosher bezdin, meaning three ordinary people, just three religious Jews that are qualified to serve as witnesses. He's considered to be a ger, convert. This is so even if it became known that he was converting for some ulterior reason. Nevertheless, because he had the aspects of meal and mikveh, and again, that this is very crucial. So is it the aspects of meal and mikveh, Kabbalas and mitzvahs, that matter more? According to the Rambam and what the Shulchan Aruch says here, it seems like these are really the two more important things. Others, as we'll see, really put more of an emphasis on the Kabbalas and mitzvahs. And here the Shulchan Aruch says that because he did these two things, the meal and the mikveh, he's no longer in this category of Avodah Zarah. He's no longer in the category of the Kochavim, of an idolater. But it says we still are choishish. We still suspect that he's not sincere until he proves himself, until his righteousness is clarified. And it says very clearly. So this is also true. If a convert goes back to the old religion, it says if he goes back to serving idols, and this is true in general, if a person were to convert to Judaism, and let's say they were to go back to the previous religion, they were to go back to being Catholic or Buddhist or whatever, they don't have a status of a goy, meaning, one of my one of my colleagues, Rabbi Jeffrey Rappaport, he should live and be well. He would always say that gear is it's like that song Hotel California. You could check out, but you can never leave. Meaning that once you're in, you're in. A person could go and sin, and the halacha here, Harechu ki Yisrael Meshumat. He has the status of a Meshumat or a Mumar. One girsa would have the status of Mumar, one would have the status of Meshumat. It's basically the same. It doesn't say Goy, it has the status of Mumar and Meshumat. He's an apostate. So he's still a Jew. He's just a bad one. So they get treated according to all of the implications of such. So it would mean that for such a person, they are obligated to do everything that a Jew is obligated to do, but they don't get counted for a minion or anything like that. He would have to give his wife a get, shikidushav kiddushin, right? The valid is considered a valid marriage, meaning that a get would be needed if they were to divorce a Jew. If he were to divorce a Jewish woman, he would have to give her a get. And I pity such a woman. I pity the situation that would come about from that, unfortunately. But yes, they have the status of a meshumit after that. So we see mitzad echad. That's on the one side. That's where one side we see this one side in the Shulchan Aruch that may be an acceptance of the commandments, the Kabbolas and mitzvahs, is maybe not so essential. And then we saw before in Seif Gimel that maybe it is essential. So is that Gemara in Becharos that we saw in the first place, that Kabbalah Soul Mitzvahs is essential? Is this the position of the Shulchan Aruch like we saw in Seif Gimel? Or is it more like what we see in Seif Yud Beis, which is very much like what we see in the Rambam? So in Seif Gimel, where we seem to think that, or where the Mechaber does seem to argue that Kabbalah Soul Mitzvahs is Ma'akiv, this is very much like the opinion of Tosfos, like the sheet of Tosfos in Yevamos Stuff Mem Zayin, in Yevamos Stuff Mem Vav, rather, V'Ibrachamaskal to Kunigaver B'Shabbat Maskinan. Says Tosfos there, Shiny Chachad the by Shiny Talmidei, Shiny Chachad the by Shnei Talmidei Chacham Lamod Sham Bishat Tevil Lo Deich HaMitzvot Ki Damrinan Lekaman. Says very clearly that we require Shnei Talmidei Chachamim, two Chachamim, two rabbis to stand there at the time of Tevilah to inform the convert of the mitzvahs. In other words, that there must be a Kabbalah o haMitzvot accompanying even the immersion in the mikveh. And the Torah even borrows this shita. The Torah learns from this that there has to be a Kabbalah of mitzvahs as well. The whole inyanav ben leodich haMitzvot, the kablam ben amilo ben Tevilah zarich sheyeh the gimel kesherim ladun v'yom mihu davka lechatchila. That every matter of gerus, the chodiyach haMitzvot, the kablam, Kabbalah Soul mitzvahs, informing the ger of the mitzvahs that we should accept him, it requires bezdin, the presence of three who are valid to judge. It has to be a valid Maisa bezdin. It has to be done during the day, and a valid legal act of the court of bezdin during the day, and with three who are fit to judge. So here, in the first place, in this first text from the Shulchan Aruch in Seif Gimel, we see that he very clearly does hold that Kabbalah Soul HaMitzvahs is very much essential. It's crucial. It's ma'akev. It's essential to the process. Elsewhere, we saw that he held like the Rambam, that maybe it's not so essential, and that if it wasn't done, it would not affect the validity of the gerus at all. And who comes to help us resolve this seeming contradiction? The Chemdash Shlomo. And the Chemdash Shlomo, he resolves this seeming contradiction, this seeming stira, by distinguishing between informing a potential ger about the mitzvot and his actual acceptance of the mitzvot. So he says that, so he looks very clearly at the words, that the Kabbalah and the Hodiyah are very much two different things. So he's making a chiluk between Chodat mitzvot and Kabbalah mitzvot, and suggests that these are separate entities. And writes the Chemdash Shlomo, he says, Ach v'daiti nirei parsha davar de'in kan kusha klal the Kabbalah mitzvot chush mekabel love bistam l'kanes v'dat Yisrael v'lasot kechol Torah v'hamitzvot v'chodat hamitzvot chush yudiu lo eichud v'chumrot hamitzvot kema shama v'gamar yevamot mem zayin v'atachil achalta chala v'chulei chlalta Shabbat yata niskal Azot katav shafir she'en chodat hamitzvot ma'akev v'Rabbeinu Hagadol b'shulchano chatachor be'er l'chodaya chodat sachar mitzvot v'onishan aval adam kabbalat hamitzvot t'chaynu shirotzi l'chinus bedat yachudu b'shita ditzrich kein nearly pasha devar de'odat hamitzvot kabbalat hamitzvot shnei inyanim heim. right? Those are the key words at the end. Shnei inyanim hem. That these are two distinct inyanim, two distinct things. Says he writes, but in my opinion, it's clear and simple that there's no question at all. For acceptance of the mitzvahs means that one accepts to enter into the religion of Israel and fulfill all the Torah commands and mitzvahs without any conditions. So again, it's very clear that how do you become that it's not gefilte fish and have a nagila here, right? It's you know listen pastrami sandwiches and klezmer music and writing checks to the Federation are all very nice things, but there's more to it than that, right? You know, you could be Jewish and not do any of that, right? In my family, and I know, I know I know Professor Elias is listening. It's roscas, bizcochos, bollos, borecas, bolinas, you know, and for us, it's ocho candelicas para mí, right? It's, we have a different culture. And, I love Ashkenazi culture. Um, you know, I relate to it very well. But, we have a very, very rich heritage, right? It's, Tarbut Yisrael, Jewish culture is, it's beyond that. It's about a relationship with the Kadosh Baruch Hu. It's about connecting to God. Peoplehood is wonderful. I have a very rich sense of peoplehood. I was talking to a very lovely and special young lady earlier today. How I love Jewish literature, right? There's a very rich Jewish literature, Yiddish stories, which I've tried to read in the original. My Yiddish isn't that great, but you have Shalom Aleichem and and the great Jewish writers, right? It's a beautiful legacy. But as great as peoplehood is, it's about Torah. It's about the God of Israel, the Torah of Israel, right? And without that, there is no people of Israel. Um, you know, um, so without that, you can't become Jewish, right? Again, you can't convert to bagels, right? There's no such thing as that. Um, you know, and he continues. He says, informing of the mitzvot refers to informing the ger of the level and stringency of the mitzvahs. Right, the Gemara tells us in Masechet Yevamot Daf Mem Zayin, right, and the Bezdin does this, and I participated in conversions actually. A very dear teacher of mine, Rabbi Gradovsky, does conversions. He actually brings the Gemara with him, and will read verbatim from the Gemara and say, just like this. Initially, forbidden fats. You were Machal Shabbat. You desecrated the Sabbath. We would not throw rocks at you. And now that you come out of the mikveh, you do that. We will throw rocks at you. Regarding this, the Shulchan Aruch writes properly. He says how nice of him to think that the Mechaber is writing correctly. That lack of informing him of the mitzvot would not invalidate the conversion. And he heaps praise on the Shulchan Aruch here. Talk about nice language, right? This is how prosaic. It's just very beautiful. Just the respect, I have to say, the level of respect that he actually shows here for the Shulchan Aruch is quite beautiful. V'Rabbeinu Chagadol b'Shulchano HaTachor Verlechudaya. The respect here he shows for the Shulchan Aruch actually in a change of tone, just as literary. Those of you who appreciate literature, such as Professor Elias, you'll appreciate this. Our great Rabbeinu Hagadol. Rabbeinu is just a title of respect. Our teacher, our great teacher, in the title is the Shulchan Aruch, and in his great pure table, his pure book, explained explicitly that this refers to the reward and punishment of the mitzvot. He says, however, it is obvious that one is always required to accept the mitzvot, state that he wishes to enter the Jewish religion, right? It seems kind of ridiculous. How do you enter a religion if you don't make a declaration that you're going to accept what the religion teaches and requires? And Kainirili Pashut, it seems to me that this is just Pashut to Bora, like this is just, it's ABC 1, 2, 3. It's elementary, it's clear and simple. that this is what it is. But he says that um, that the Beit Din, the court, informing of the commandments and the convert himself accepting the commandments, two separate issues. So, in other words, he says if the Beit Din were to fail to, have a discussion to tell the convert, that these are the mitzvahs of the Torah, and we fail to explain the aspects of schar v'onesh, reward and punishment. If they make a procedural mistake, if everything else was done correctly, he says, that's not something that would invalidate the conversion. But if the convert were to fail to wholeheartedly make an acceptance of the mitzvahs of the Torah, like the Achiezer and Reb Moshe and the Gemara and Bechora says has to be done, then that would invalidate the conversion. So, in other words, what the Shulchan Aruch is talking about, um, he says, is that the ger, the convert accepting the mitzvahs, is required and would invalidate the gerus if performed improperly or not at all. On the other hand, if the dayanim, if the judges informing the convert about the nature and severity of the mitzvahs is not done, that would not invalidate the gerus, provided that the convert still agreed to be makabel upon himself to accept all of the mitzvahs of the Torah upon himself. So this is the way that the Chemda Shlomo would resolve the two separate positions, not only of the Shulchan Aruch, but this would also really be his way, seemingly, to resolve what would, I think, seem to be this seeming stira or machlokus between the Torah and Tosfos on the one hand and the Rambam on the other. So he explains that according to the Mechaber, the Kabbolas haMitzvos is not just central to the Gerus, it is the essence of the Gerus. And he emphasizes that it's Musar L'Leiv, that it's in the heart. That the essence of the Gerus is that the guy is leaving his deity, he's coming to take shelter tachas kanfei Shechina, under the wings of the divine presence. He's accepting upon himself Yahadus to enter into the community of Hashem, and that's really what Gerus is, just as we did on Har Sinai, on Shavuos. And so this seems to really come back to this machlokus between Reb Nechemia and the Chachamim we saw earlier, and the Achiezer suggested that really that the foundation of Gerus is what one's intention is, has to be done b'leiv shalom wholeheartedly, and says that really Reb Nechemia and the Chachamim are disagreeing as to whether we have to assume that one who is Megaya for ulterior reasons did not do it wholeheartedly. So he writes, the Achiezer is saying that according to Reb Nechemia, again, it's dissimilar to other acts in halacha because Kabbolas haMitzvos itself, as the Kabbolas haMitzvos itself, and the gerus is in one's heart, and as long as he's megaya without a full heart, he's not considered to be a ger. And as we said, again, this concept of the Chachamim are saying that one's primary motivation for gerus, it doesn't necessarily impact upon his ability to accept upon himself to fulfill the mitzvahs. So in the absence of that umdana de mukach, that overwhelming circumstantial evidence that he was megayer for the sake of marriage, we would end up with a suffix. So out of our Gemara, we're going to see that the sheet of Reb Chaim Oizer, it's going to, we'll see if it stems or not with that of another Achron who came a little bit before in the base, Yitzchak or Yitzchak Shmelkes. From that Gemara in Yevamos, right? The Gemara is citing Reb Nechemia, saying that a person who converts l'shem ishus, it's not considered to be a true gerus. And so forth. Practically, actually, many poskim do not go by this, and they will do a gerus l'shem ishus in many cases. right? The Gemara says, the Gemara has this discussion, or those that are Megayer due to fear of lions, with, the Gemara concludes that the halacha doesn't follow Reb Nechemiah, so maybe, there could be some room on this. So we're going to look actually at the Ritva, very important sheet of the Ritva, and it gives a basis kind of to this discussion. So says the Ritva, the Hiksha B'Tosfos Kevan degree Rayos Gerim L'Rabbanim, Lama Amr Shehem Kagoyim Lamanda Amr Gedia Rayos Heim. The Teretzu the Shiny Chatam Shakatuv Omer Aleichem Beit Eloheim Hayu Oivdim Lama Shlo Ditgairu Belev Shalim Meolam Velo Kiblu Aleihem Umanda Michsha Chatam Sevar Shenit Giru Shitgairu Belev Shalim Elachazru L'Suram Aval HaChaba Kevan the Nidgairu V'Kiblu Alechem Chazaka Hu the Agav in Sehu Gamru V'Kiblu V'Af Al-Gav the Mechamat Ha'onis Chove Gerut Hu Aliba de Rabbanim. So the Ritva says that on our Gemara in Yevamos, he's commenting as follows. So it says Tosfos asks that since those who are Megayer due to fear of lions, as the Gemara says, right, the Chachamim are saying that these are considered to be valid Gerim, unlike Reb Nechemiah, who says that they're not because they were just Megayer B'ones out of fear, an ulterior motive, right? So the Ritva here understands that if, as the Gemara states, the halacha is not like Reb Nechemiah, then there has to be a majority opinion against him, which he refers to as that of the Chachamim. The Mishnah follows their opinion that, in fact, these are valid Gerim. So Tosfos asks, so why did certain Chachamim view these Gerim as Goyim, according to those who hold that the Kutim were Megayer due to fear of lions, as we mentioned, right? So the Samaritans, the Kutim, as we mentioned in our read of the Gemara before. So, yeah, we'll give let's give a little bit of background on this actually. So, so the story of the conversion of the Kutim, the Samaritans. So the Kutim were a group of non-Jews that settled in the Shomron, Samaria, after the exile of the 10 tribes. And they apparently did some form of a conversion, but there always was a question as to their motives. And they were not careful in their observance of the mitzvot, right? So they did not do a very good job at making a Kabbalah mitzvot. And therefore, many questions were raised by the rabbis about their status. So, that's in a nutshell the story about the Kutim and their invalid conversion. Gerei Arayot, they were not genuine. They converted because they were eaten by lions. So we see this story actually mentioned in Sefer Melachim. This is going to be mentioned in the second book of Kings, chapter 17. Roughly, in the second book of Kings, chapter 17, roughly around there, we see the discussion about the story of the conversion of the Kutim and their insincere conversion. Around verse 33, actually. So, if you'd like to look into Tanakh, that would be a good place to sort of get a background on this. So, so in regards to the Kutim, they, it says explicitly, that Hashem chayu yereim, v'et Eloheim chayu ovdim, kibishpat chagoyim asher higlu otam misham. Right, so these Kutim, they appear to worship Hashem, but they still They still did their own thing, basically. They were insincere. They, they were insincere. They didn't follow Torah. They did whatever they wanted. And they were idolaters, and so forth. And so, they never converted with a full heart. They never accepted the mitzvot upon themselves. The Tanakh says explicitly this was the case. So continues the advice, says the Shita, the opinion that validates their gerus there holds that they did convert with a whole heart, but they returned to their former ways. They were chayzer b'yisuro. So this would apply to that opinion. So is there any applicable? So can we learn anything from the Kutim to what the Shulchan Aruch says about a member? Let's say. However, continues the advice, says, but here, so other instances of gerus, people that converted, due to fear, out of unsale, meaning it was out of ones. The very important, says the Ritva, since they were Megayer, they accepted the mitzvot upon themselves. Says there is a chazaka. There is a halachic presumption that due to their duress, because they did this in a state of ones, due to duress, they decided to accept the mitzvot. And even though it was only out of a state of duress, it is still considered to be a valid gerus according to the Chachamim, Alibud de Rabbanan. So according to the Ritva, the Chachamim hold that the case of the Kutim did not involve a sincere conversion. By contrast, the conclusion of the Gemara that other conversions that were done out of duress to the fear of lions are valid, it is limited to a case where a sincere Kabbalah haMitzvot, to a case where a sincere acceptance of mitzvot also took place, even if the motive for the acceptance was fear. And likewise, says the Ritva, it would seem that the case of gerus for the sake of marriage, that is a machloket in the Gemara, that is disputed in the Gemara, should also be limited to where one also performed a genuine Kabbalat haMitzvot. And based on this understanding, we come to the Beis Yitzchak, Rav Yitzchak Shnochus, who says that if a person converts only for the sake of marriage, and there is no intention on keeping the mitzvot, the conversion is not a valid one. So let's look in the Beit Yitzchak. This is in Chelik Beit Teshuvah Kaf 100. So he's articulating the approach previously regarding Kabbolas haMitzvos that the Achiezer promulgated. So we'll give a little bit of background. So again, he's dealing with the case of marriage, and it's highly questionable that the prospective ger, or Georit in this case, would really intend to live an observant life. So first, he's really ruling in line with the Gemara and against certain other poskim of his time that that conversion for the sake of marriage would be prohibited lechatchila in the first place. Now, the Gemara does seem to say that a conversion would work, at least b'diavad, at least post facto, but he questions whether this would apply even in cases where we know that the person is not sincerely accepting upon themselves to observe any mitzvot. The question being what level of commitment of observance is required and whether we have to concern ourselves about their intentions, especially if, as far as we could tell, they may or may not be sincere, of course, is very relevant today. Right, so he opens up the tshuva by saying, "Al davar shela be'echad shechayelu yod mishpacha relit u'meta yishto v'ratza v'isach relit chanal achar shetitkayer v'im lo yatil lo yedo yima b'yisur yishana b'derech zivla im atirim lo yisur ze shelo yavo liday v'rot chamorot roshin rasha הבית דין להסתדק דוודאי גם אחרי שתתקיים לו תשמעו יסוד נידה וגם ויקרא גרות היא מגרעין אותה הואיל והיא לשום ישות והיא יש יסוד לישא אותה משום הניתן על חשיבך. Regarding the question of whether a person who had a child from a non-Jewish woman, maidservant, non-Jewish female maidservant, his wife has now died, and now he wants to marry this Gentile woman after she converts. Says now, if we don't permit him to do so, he's going to live with her in a state of sin, or he's going to marry her in a civil marriage. So, do we permit this prohibition for him to marry a woman with whom he had an affair, so that he should not violate weighty transgressions? Or is the Beit Din not allowed to deal with the case, since it's certain that even after she converts, she's not? Their concern is dafka that she's not going to keep the laws of Taharat HaMishpacha. Neither. She's not going to go to the mikveh and separate, and keep all those laws. Moreover, he says regarding the gerus itself, are we allowed to convert her since it's for the sake of marriage? And there is a as we saw in the Gemara Yevamos stuff, Dalit, there is a prohibition for him to marry her because of the rule of somebody who has been suspected of having an affair with a maidservant, and then he's not allowed to marry. So let's get to the important part about Kabbolas and mitzvahs. What does the basic Yitzchak say about that? הנה בגוף הדבר דעם שנתקיה לשום תועלת דלהלכה כולם גאים. תא ברידווה בשם הרמב"ם, בטעם הדבר כאיוון דהתגיירו וקיבלו אליכם חזקה, הידע אגב, even סייל גמרו וקיבלו, בוכח דעל כל פנים באש שיקבלו בלב שלם חמיצוות, מה שאין כן אם נגיה רק לפנים וליבו בא ללמוד לחזיק במצוות, ואנו יודעים כוונתו שגם אחר כך בועל נידו מחלל שבת ואוכל תכפות, לא רגע כלל, ולא שייך לומר בזה דברים שבלב הם דברים, וזה דברים שבלב הם דברים, ואם בליבו שלו יקיימם, רחמנה לבוא באה ולא נעשה גר. Rachmana לבוא באה, beautiful. God desires the heart, right? It's one of my favorite phrases. I remind myself of that almost multiple times a day. Rachamanu l'bo ba'eh, that God desires the heart. Now he says regarding the main matter that if a person converted for an ulterior motive, he says that the halacha is that a person is considered to be a valid convert. And just as we saw, in the Ritva, says the Ritva, he writes in the name of the Ramban that the reason is, since they converted, they accepted the mitzvot upon themselves. The presumption is that due to their forced situation, they decided to accept these mitzvot. They did it under duress. It's still clear that they nevertheless must accept the mitzvot with a whole heart. He says, by contrast, if a person converts externally only, but his heart is not with him to keep the mitzvot, and we know that his intention is that even after the conversion, he's going to have relations with the nidah, he's going to desecrate Shabbat, he's going to eat non-kosher food, he's not considered to be a convert at all. And he says there's a rule of matters of the heart have no halachic significance. Generally, we say devarim shebelev ein devarim, that matters of the heart, internal matters, we can't really go by. He says this isn't applicable here because so if in his heart he didn't intend to keep the mitzvot, he says Hashem desires the heart, and then he's not considered a convert. Right? So just some background here. So the Gemara Masechet Kiddushin Daf Mem Ted Lamed Beit establishes this principle, Devarim Shebelevenu Devarim, meaning that if you conduct, let's say, a business transaction or a marriage based on a certain assumption or a condition that didn't come to pass, but was never verbalized, it's still valid because we say that a mental intention that was not verbalized is part of the agreement. It's not halachically significant. But the basic Yitzchak is stating here that with regard to conversion, proper acceptance of the mitzvot, it's essential, and it certainly is dependent upon a person's intention, even if it was not verbalized. So not only would a conversion be invalid if the convert declares clearly that it's being performed solely for the sake of marriage, but the same would apply when it's clear that this is his intention, even if it's not explicated. And this principle we have in the Gemara, disregarding mental intent, devarim shebelevein and devarim, it's not applicable in this context. Now, Chaim Ozer, you should note, disagrees with what the Beis Yitzchak is saying regarding the scope of Kabbolas and mitzvahs. but he appears to fundamentally agree with the way he understands Gerus. And so does Reb Moshe, who we'll see here, brings out Gemara in Yevamos and was dealing actually with a pretty fascinating case. Um, so obviously, an improper or partial acceptance of mitzvahs would indeed invalidate the gerus. But what is the extent of this rule? So, does this mean that the admission of a ger that they're going to be incapable of fulfilling one detailed aspect of the halacha, would this puzzle the entire gerus? And this is something that Rav Moshe actually dealt with. So, Rav Moshe in Yeridea Chelik Aleph Shuva Chaf Nun Zayin, he deals actually with the case. This is very interesting. So, this is the case of a woman in the process of converting. She was considering working on the upcoming Yom Tov. She had to work on Yom Tov Sheni because she was afraid of being fired. And Reb Moshe actually says that such intentions would not render the conversion invalid. And he says, similarly, if you had a guy who wanted to convert, but he declares his uncertainty as to whether he would be able to give up his life rather than to violate the three Averes Yaharig V'Yavor. So this is another concept I think we've mentioned before. So the Torah allows you to basically, we're all familiar with the idea that you could violate anything in the Torah to save a life, but there are three exceptions. There are three things in the Torah that you may not violate in order to save a life. And that's called that's called Yaharig Vel Yavor. You may not commit avodah zarah, idolatry. You may not commit shivchas dam, and murder. And you may not commit arayot, sexual sins in order to save a life. Those are three transgressions you may not commit in order to save a life, according to the Torah. So if a person, according to Reb Moshe, wanted to convert, but they're uncertain as to whether they would really give up his life rather than violate these three things, then that would actually be a valid conversion. And Reb Moshe reasons, he tainas, that if one truly wishes to follow the halacha, but they feel compelled to transgress the isser due to extenuating circumstances, then the Kabbolas haMitzvos is considered to be chal. It's considered to be valid. So, Moshe says as follows. He says it's mistaber. It's logical. Mistaber excuse me. Mistaber mi mashmaus. Kama devarim the gish kibel the gish shekabel kol mitzvahs. Aval amar lebeistin she'af shemakabel alav kol mitzvahs yodei shlo yuchal amod b'nisayon laharig keshia an suhu b'dvarim shehein hu yahareg v'lo yavor shenech nishav kabbalas mitzvahs me'acher shekiblu chiyuv mitzvahs l'kaimam keshia vach be'efshar shehu shelo teheanusa ומה שתעבור הוא מפני שאין דחוך לעמוד בניסיון אף שברצונו לקיים המצווה ולא לעבור. מסתבר דווקא שיאמר שלא יוכל לעמוד בניסיון למון דהוא הדין. Moshe says, it seems logical, it's mistaber. It's a good word, a good yeshiva word you like when something's mistaber, logical. He says it's mistaber, it's logical from the implication from a number of sources, that if a ger accepted all the mitzvahs, but told the Bezdin that although she were to accept all of the mitzvahs, but she knows that she wouldn't be able to, let's say, withstand the test of giving up her life under duress, rather than do one of the averas for which one has to give up one's life, Yaharid Vel Yavor. He says it's actually considered to be an acceptance of the mitzvahs. Why? He says this is so since she is accepted to keep all the mitzvahs in circumstances where she's not under duress. And that under which she would transgress under duress, it's due to the fact that she couldn't withstand this trial, even though she truly wants to keep the mitzvahs and not transgress. It's mistaber, it's logical that even if a person says that they wouldn't be able to withstand a test regarding, let's say, financial matters, he says the same thing would apply. And continuing in the same tshuva, Reb Moshe will continue with the idea that um, if a person were not to intend to fulfill the mitzvahs, that it would not be a valid gerus at all, anyways. So continuing the same tshuva, Reb Moshe says, "Ba'mishin istatek v'otar tvim ger shelo kibul mitzvahs im nechshav ger, pasher bar shenu ger klal af b'diavad v'chein charabi mari hagon zeches dadik v'chay olam haba halach l'maisa." ואף אם אמר בפיו שמקבל מצווסים, אנן סעדי שאינו מקבל אלא באמס, אינו כלום, וגר שמעני לשם אישוס בדיעבד, הרי שבשביל האישוס קיבל עליו מצוות. So, says, nonetheless, he was asked, there was some uncertainty whether a ger didn't accept mitzvahs is considered a ger. He says it's clear and simple, not a ger at all, even b'diavad, even after the fact. He says that his father said that this was the halacha l'maisa, and he says that even if such a ger stated verbally that he accepts the mitzvahs, he says if we could attest anan sadeh, meaning if we could attest to something, we could attest to the factuality of something, if we were witnesses to it, that he doesn't truthfully accept them upon himself, it's meaningless. And dealing with the subject of Ishus, he says, if it's for the sake of Ishus, he says it's valid b'diavad based on the Gemara in Yevamos daf chaf daled amid base. Says it's only where he truly accepted the mitzvahs upon himself, albeit for albeit for the purposes of marriage. Now, it's interesting to think of Rav Yitzchak Kook, as being very lenient, and in many ways he was very open-minded. But when it came to halacha, he was actually very strict. What was interesting was actually, though, he held that the concept of Devrim, that the Devrim Shebelev Devarim, he held that this was applicable even in regards to Gerus, and so he paskined that if the Ger accepted the mitzvahs verbally, we could convert him, even if he did so primarily for an ulterior motive, and the Bezdin suspects that the acceptance wasn't genuine. So this is in Shustas Kain Simon Simon Gimel. Says the Das Kain, he says, Kolzman Shaita Kabbalah Bepikarai, Yesh Lamashin Lanu Inyan Im Davrim Shabala Ve'eshenam Davrim Klal, Ve'afilu Im Yavo, Elena V'yagid Lanu Shachaya Bilvavo, Acheret Me'asher Befiv Ein Lanu Esa Klal Im Davrim Shabalev. Says the Das Kain, he says, as long as the verbal acceptance was done properly, we could say that we have no concern for mental intent, which has no significance at all. Even if he later comes and tells us that he had other intentions in his heart than what he stated, we don't deal at all with mental intent. We're not concerned. Now, when speaking about conversions done for ulterior motives, very famous example comes to mind, which came up, I believe, the week before last in one of the Parsha Shiurim, and this has to do with the famous story of the ger that came to Hillel to want to convert, because that's the classic story of a conversion that would have been done for an ulterior motive. This is a story found in Masechet Shabbat Daf Lamed Aleph Amud Aleph, Tractate Shabbat Daf 31a. So, a very famous story. Many of you may know it. Tanu Rabbanan Master V'Goy Echad Sheba Lifnei Shammai. Amar Lo Kama Torah Yesh Lachem. Amar Lo Shtayim Torah Shebitcha v'Torah Shebal Peh. So the rabbis taught there was an incident involving a guy who came before Shammai, and the guy said to Shammai, "How many Torahs do you have?" And he said them two, the written and the oral. And the guy said to Shammai, "With regard to the written, I believe you, but with regard to the oral, I don't." Right? Amar lo shtayim Torah shebichtav Torah shebal Amar lo Torah shebichtav ani man mincha v'shebal pei any man mincha. Gerani al minat shetilamedeni Torah shebichtav. Gaba v'chotzi bin sifa. Balif nechel gayrei. Yom echam amar le. Al beit gimel dalet. Bimchar apechle. Amar le. Vayet lo amar li chachi. Amar le. Lavalei didi kasamechat. Dal pei nami samachamai. Right. So the guy says to him, I believe you regarding the written, but not regarding the oral. So he says to him, convert me on condition that you're going to teach me only the written. The guy was like a Karaite, so Shammai scolded him and cast him out with reprimand. And the same guy came before Hillel, who converted him and began teaching him. And on the first day, he showed him the letters of the Aleph Beit and taught him Aleph, Yamakam Amerle, Amr Beit, Aleph Beit Gimel Dalet. And the next day, he reversed the orders of the letters and told him that an Aleph is a Tav and so forth. So the Ger said to him, but yesterday you didn't tell me that. And Hillel said to him, you see that it's impossible to learn what's written without relying on an oral tradition. Said, didn't you rely on me? And he says that's why you have to rely on me with regard to the matter of the oral Torah and accept Torah Shebal Peh also. That was the way of Hillel. So we'll see here that these were cases of, and the poskim are going to find this difficult. How Hillel as well as Rav Chia were able to convert a number of individuals, even though they did not clearly maybe have a full Kabbolas and mitzvahs. So let's look at Rashi. And Rashi explains that Shammai did not agree to convert the person in question because of the halach we saw in Maseches Bechoros, that if a person were to accept the entire Torah, except for one matter, we cannot convert them. So Rashi comments here, Hoitziel ben Zifa, Tanya v'chein ger lechikayr v'kibel of divrei Torah chutz midavar echad, ein mekablinota b'Masechet Bechorot daf lamed. Cast him out with reprimand because it's taught in the Brisa. Similarly, a goy who comes to convert and accept the Torah except for one matter, we don't accept him, as it's brought in Masechet Bechorot daf lamed amud beit. Hillel, on the other hand, what does Rashi say? The guy Riha, "B'samachal chochmato shesofo sheyargilenu lekabel alav halachotz midavar echad shelo chaya kofa b'tor shebal pe'ela shelo haya mamin shehi mipich gevura Hillel huftach shachar sheyamudenu yismoch alav." Hillel, on the other hand, Rashi says, "B'samachal chochmato," he relied on his wisdom. He assumed that in the end he would accustom the ger to accept it upon himself. And Rashi says this is not similar to chutz midavar echad. This is not similar to except for one matter, because he did not deny Torah Shebal Peh. Rather, he didn't believe that it was from Hashem. But Hillel was sure that after he would teach him, the ger would rely upon him. So Rashi's explanation of Hillel's actions is quite difficult to understand. So what is the basis to accept such a ger who didn't demonstrate a proper Kabbolas and mitzvahs, who didn't demonstrate a proper acceptance of mitzvahs at the time of the conversion? So how could Hillel sort of rely on his own wisdom in converting him without what would seemingly be required by halacha, even if Hillel was sure that the Kabbalah, the acceptance, would be complete at a later time? And one who doesn't believe in Torah Shabbat, who doesn't believe in the oral Torah being from God. We would call him a Karaite, a heretic, right? Karaites are, they still exist. Back then we called them Sadducees. Um, but these were Jews that did not believe in the oral Torah, right? They would sit in the dark and eat cold food on Shabbat. And you have like 50,000 of them that still exist in Israel. And, they're kind of a very idiosyncratic bunch. Very interesting people, but, they are heretics, right? They're not, they are heretics and, they're not theologically the same as us. So the second question was actually addressed by Reb Moshe. And again, we see, and again, it's the same approach actually. He addresses the same question, and again, it's the same approach, the same mahalach that Rav Moshe expresses towards Kabbolas and mitzvahs again. So this is in Yoredeya Chelik Gimel, Shuvachaf Vav. So says Rav Moshe, Chen Zarich Lama Shekevan Sheikal Kol. Sheikal Kol Panim Kabbalat Mitzvot, Afshalo Bechulan Hugeshin Chayev Bechulan Afshalo Kiblam. דחייב מנה מה שכתוב בתורה ואין קבלת חמיצות משום דקבלה קבלת חמיצות דיאפשר לחייבו אלא דהודים ממעשה הגרות ממעשה הגרות דהבינו קבלת המצוות כמו דהבינו מילות תבילה וסנינו לזה קבלת איזה מצוות אף שלא קיבלו כולן. ממעשה גורדים קבלת המצוות כמו דהבינו מילות תבילה וסנינו לזה קבלת איזה מצוות אף שלא קיבלו כולן. אף קושר לרש"י על הילו, שקבלך לכתחילה דאין מקבלין אף כשלא קיבל עליו אף רק דבר אחד, וכל שכן שלא חיה לקבל גם זה, שלא קיבל עליו כל התורה שבעל פה, ועל זה תרד שפיר, שהיה הילו מובטח שאחר שילמדנו לסמוך עליו, וקיים גם כל דיני תורה שבעל פה. Therefore, one must say that since there was some acceptance of mitzvahs, even though it was not complete, he is a ger, and he's now mechuyev in all the mitzvahs, even though he didn't accept all of them, because this is considered sort of making a tanai, stipulating a condition against what is written in the Torah. But Moshe continues, he says, now don't think that the reason for making him accept the mitzvahs is in order to be able to punish him. Because if he didn't accept the mitzvahs, how could we punish him? He says, rather, it's a necessary act of the Geirus process, similar to bris milah and tefillah and mikveh, and it is sufficient to accept some of the mitzvahs, even though he didn't accept all of them. He says, however, Rashi was bothered how Hillel could accept how Hillel could convert such a person that could heal in the first place, because it stated that we don't accept somebody even if he doesn't accept merely one matter. Certainly, then he shouldn't have accepted such a person who didn't accept all of the oral Torah. And Rav Moshe continues. He says, so about this point, he says, Rashi explained nicely, as we saw, that Hillel was sure that after he taught him, he would rely upon him and fulfill all of, the halachas, all of the rules in the oral Torah. Aval natan v'chavtachato de Hillel, shechaya ze v'chamet shelo chaya kofer b'torah shebalte, sheodea shike Torah kazo, ach lo chemin leHillel shama sheomer, Ochiot tachat Torah shenitna mipia gevura, שבזה חיה שייך שיסמוך עליו אחר שילמדנו, לכן פירוש ידע הנוכרי שיש תורה שבעל פה, אבל אמר שלא מאמין להלל, שלכן שייך עשייה שיסמוך עליו. Okay. Rashi gave a reason for Hillel's certainty. It says it was because the Ger didn't reject the concept of Torah Shebaal Peh, because he knew that the concept of such a Torah existed, but rather he didn't believe that what Hillel was teaching him was from the same Torah given from Hashem, given from Kadosh Baruch Hu. So regarding this, it was possible for Hillel to assume that he would rely upon him, Hillel, after he would teach the Ger. So therefore, Rashi explained that the guy acknowledged that there is a Torah Shabbat, but said that he didn't believe Hillel that his teachings were included. And so in this regard, it was possible for Hillel to be certain that he would rely upon him. So according to Reb Moshe, the Ger did believe in Torah Shabbat. He wasn't considered to be an Apikoros. He's simply a heretic. He simply did not believe that whatever Hillel would teach him was part of the Torah Shabbat of the oral Torah. So Rashi is therefore saying that concerning this lack of belief, Hillel was sure that he would convince him that this too was part of the oral Torah. So according to Rashi, then it is permitted to convert such an individual based on such certainty, but a lack of belief in the Torah itself would certainly invalidate a gerus. Um, and Ramosha's the way that he learns Rashi, it's not such a simple reading actually of Rashi's words that he didn't believe that it was from Hashem, which would seem to refer to the entire oral Torah, rather than statements of Hillel alone. So Rashi here is referring actually to a stage of the discussion prior to when Hillel actually began to teach the convert. Um, and there's actually another story in the Gemara, and this will cast some further light onto the question as to how Hillel could rely on future events if the acceptance of mitzvahs at the time of Gerus appears to be flawed. So the story cited in the Gemara Menachos, Daf Mem Dalet Amud Aleph, also presents a problem with the premise that the acceptance of mitzvot has to be completed not for the purpose of an ulterior motive. So the story is actually a bit of a salacious one. This is a bit salacious, a bit spicy for maybe some of the readers, but um, this is this is Torah, and I too must learn it. Um, but it's a nice story, actually. And it's actually a story that there's actually a sort of a previous precedent. It has sort of like a parallel to the story of Hosea, to the prophet Hosea, um, because the prophet Hosea actually ended up marrying a prostitute also. בחכך הים שנוטלת דוד מאוד זכובים בשכרה שהגיע לך באמת זכובים וקבע הזמן כשהגיע זמנו בא וישב על הפתח. So there was a Maisa, an incident involving a certain man who was very diligent about the mitzvah of wearing tzitzis. And this man heard that there was a prostitute in one of the cities overseas who took 400 gold coins as her payment. So he sent her 400 gold coins and fixed a time to go meet up with her. And when his time came, he came and sat at the entrance to her house of ill repute. נכנסה שפחתה ואמרה לה אותו אדם ששיגר לכדלת מאוד זכובים וישב על הפתח אמר לי יכנס נכנס הציע לו זין מיטות שיש של כסף ואחת של זכר ובין כל אחת ואחת סולם של כסף ועליונה של זכב. So the maid servant of that prostitute entered and said to her, that man who sent you 400 gold coins came and sat at the entrance. And she said, let him enter. So he entered, and she arranged 7 beds for him, 6 of silver and 1 of gold. You know, get your heads out of the gutter, men. Between each and every one of them, there was a ladder made of silver, and the top bed was the one that was made of gold. עליו לשב ערום כנגדה באו דלת ציציותיו וטפחו לו על פניו נשמת ישב לו אגב קרקע ואף חיד נשמתה וישבה על גף קרקע אמרה לו גבה שרמי שני מניחתך שתאמר לי מה לא ראיתי בי. He went up and sat naked at the top bed, and he too went up in order to sit naked facing her. And in the meantime, his 4th tzitzis came and gave him a good slap on the face, and he dropped down and sat himself on the ground, and he became a good boy, and she also dropped down and sat on the ground, and she said to him, I took an oath by the Gappa of Rome that I will not allow you to go until you tell me what defect you saw in me. So Her feelings were hurt. Her self-esteem was shot from this religious awakening of his. כמותיך אלה מצווה אחת, ציוונו השם אלוקינו וציצית שמלכתי בה, אני השם אלוקיכם שתי פעמים, אני חושייתי לבך ואני חושייתי לשלם שכר, עכשיו נדמו עליי כעדה לידי דין. He said to her, I take an oath by the temple service, by the worship in the temple, that I never saw a woman as beautiful as you. But he said there's one mitzvah that our God commanded us, and its name is tzitzit. And in the passage where it's commanded in the Torah, it's written twice, I am the Lord your God, Hashem your God. And the Gemara says the doubling of this phrase indicates, I am the one who will punish those who transgress my mitzvot, and I am the one who will reward those who fulfill them. Now said the man, the four sets of tzitzit appeared to me as if they were four witnesses who would testify against me. אמרה לו, איני מניחך עד שתאמר לי מה שמך ומה שם עירך ומה שם רבך ומה שם יתרשך, שאתה למדו בתורה, אתה ונתן בידה. He said to him, I will not allow you to go until you tell me what is your name, what is the name of your city, what is the name of your rabbi, and what is the name of the base medrash where you learn Torah. He wrote the information, he placed it in the hand. שליש למחות ושליש לעניים ושליש נטלה בידה חוץ מאותן מצאות. She arose, she divided all of her property, giving 1/3 as a bribe to the government, 1/3 to the poor, and she took 1/3 with her in her possession, in addition to those beds of gold and silver. ויעשוני גירות עמלה, אבל הביטי שמע עינייך נתת באחד מן התלמידים חצי הכתב מידה ונתן לו עמלה. She came to the base medrash Rabbi and said to him, my teacher, instruct your students concerning me and have them make me a giyaret. She wanted to convert. And Rav Chia said to her, my daughter, maybe one of you cites on one of the Talmidim, maybe you want one of the Bachrim, and that's why you want to convert. And she took the note the student had given from her hand and gave it to Rav Chia. He said to her, go take possession of your purchase. These beds that she had arranged for him in a prohibited fashion, she now arranged for him in a permitted fashion. So the point of the story is that Reb Chia, he allowed the woman to convert despite the fact that she clearly intended to marry the student immediately following the conversion. So, Reb Chia could convert her, and how did he do so? He converted her for the sake of marriage, l'shem ishus, in light of the principle stated in the Gemara Yevamot that we saw, that maybe we shouldn't do that. So we have another story recorded in Gemara Shabbat, Masechet Shabbat, Daf Lamed Aleph, Amud Aleph, about another story involving Hillel and Shammai. שוב מעשה בגוי אחד שבלפני שמאי, אמר לו, גרעני על מנת שתלמדני כל התורה כולה כשאני עומד על רגל אחת. So this is another one of those this is another story of a goy who comes before Shammai and says to him, convert me, a lot of chutzpah. G'areni al menat shetalamideni kol haTorah kula, teach me the entire Torah while standing on one foot. So what does Shammai do? He pushes him away with the builder's cubit in his hand. And Hillel, the same guy comes before Hillel, and Hillel converts him. We all know the story. So he called Torah Kola, Veidach Peroshahu, Zilgemo. Hillel converts him and says to him, what we call the golden rule, that which is hateful to you, do not do to another. This is the entire Torah. The rest is commentary. Now go study. שוב מעשה בגוי אחד שחיה עובר אחרי בית המדרש, ושמע כל סופר שחיה אומר, ואלה אחד בגדים אשר יעשו חושן ויפות, אמר חללו למי? אמר לו לכהן גדול. אומר לו אותו גוי בעצמו, בא לפני שמאי, אמר לו, תראיני על מנת שתשימני כהן גדול, תכף בהמת חי בניין שבידו, בא לפני הלל גרי. Another guy was passing behind the Beit Midrash, and he heard the voice of a teacher teaching Torah to the students, teaching them about the Big Day Kahuna, teaching them about the garments that the Kohen Gadol would wear, right? The breastplate and the robe, all of the Big Day Kahuna, all of the garments that the high priest would wear, and the guy liked the sound of this, and the Kohen asks, who are these designated for? And the students say to him, for the Kohen Gadol, for the high priests, and he liked the sound of it. And the guy says to himself, well, I'm going to go convert so that they'll make me the high priest. And he asks Shammai, go convert me on condition that you make me the high priest. And Shammai likes getting a lot of mileage out of this builder's cubit. So he pushes him away with that thing. And then he comes before Hillel, and Hillel converts him. אבל לא, כלום מעמידים נלך אלא מי שיודע תכסיסי מלכות, לך לבוא תכסיסי מלכות, חלך וקרא, כיוון שהגיע ועזר הקרב יומת, אמר להם, וחזל מנעמה, אמר לו אפילו על דוד מלך ישראל, נעשה אותו גר, קל וחומר בעצמו, מה ישראל שניחו בנים למקום מתוך החווה, שהחווה קרא לכם, ואני בכל ישראל כתיב עליכם וחזר הקרב יומת, גר הכלל שבא במקלו ובתרמילו על אחת כמה וכמה. Hillel said to him, to the convert, is it not the way of the world that only one who knows the tachsise, the ways of royalty to be appointed king? So he says to him, go and learn the royal protocols by engaging in Torah study. So he goes and he learns. And when he reaches so there's the pasuk that says, the common man that draws near shall be put to death, and the convert says to Hillel, who is this pasuk speaking of that? And Hillel says to him, it says that this is even regarding David Melech Israel, even regarding King David. And so the convert, he uses this sort of reasoning. He's using Kal V'chaimer reasoning. He says, so if Klal Yisrael, the Jewish people, are called Hashem's children, and due to the love that Hashem loved them, he calls them, he says that Israel is, my firstborn son. And nevertheless, it's written about them that the common man that draws near shall be put to death. And a mere convert who comes without merit, with nothing more than his staff and his traveling bag, he says all the more so that this should apply to him as well. ולפני שמאי אומר לו כלום רואה, אני לראות כהן גדול, והלא כתיבת תורה ואחזה הקרב יומת, בא לפני הלל אמר לו, ענוותן הלל ינוחו לך ברכות על חושך, שקרבתני תחת כנפי השכינה, לימים נזדבבו שלושתן במקום אחד, עמו כבדרותו של שמאי ביקשה לטרודנו מן העולם, נבטנותו של חילל הקרב, So the convert comes before Shammai and told him that he retracts his demand to appoint him the Kohen Gadol, saying, am I at all worthy to be the Kohen Gadol? Is it not written in the Torah that the common man that draws near shall be put to death? And he came before Hillel and said to him, Hillel, patient one, may blessings rest upon your head as you brought me under the wings of the Shekhinah. And the Gemara relates that eventually the three converts gathered together in one place, and they said, Shammai's impatience sought to draw us from the world, and the patience of Hillel brought us tachat kanfei Shekhinah, beneath the wings of the divine presence. So, as in the first two incidents, the basis for the validity of the scaris, where the converts seem to have an ulterior motive, it's a very difficult thing to understand. And we're going to look at the Maharsha, who gives us sort of a bit of a gavita here. So let's look at the Maharsha in this Gemara. Says the Maharsha, Amrlei Mikra Karo Micha, Mikra Havel, the Memrachachi, Mishum, the Lechove, Mekabel, the Giru Michu, Ketzat Kashe, Ain Mekabel Gay, Mishum Shulchan Melachim, Velo Mishum Mishud, Lo Divze, Shigat Smo, Mishum Keuna, Shilvesh Bekavod. צריך לומר, כמה בא לפני חילול וגריך, חולי לבטחה, אלא דלא area ad levater chachisha the gar so bichuna velo kamer liu the gar ela shagabilav the gar mitoch shel lishma balishma. So Barney said to him with regard to whom is the verse speaking. So the Marsha says, but at the outset, Hillel did not tell him about this verse, about this pasuk, because then he would not have agreed to convert. But it's a difficulty, right? So the Marsha says we don't accept converts for an ulterior motive, for the sake of, as we saw in the Gemara in Yevamos, we don't accept them for the sake of marriage or for the sake of sitting at the king's table. And this one, he was Magayer, he wanted kahuna, he wanted for the sake of priesthood, so that he could wear the big day kahuna. It's no better than these. So says the Marsha, one must answer that when it says that he came before Hillel, he converted him. He says this is lav tafka, right? He says explicitly. The Marsha says lav tafka. It's not precise, not literal. He says rather it means that he only converted him after this incident when he knew that a ger is forbidden to become a kohen. Right? A ger can't become a kohen. So the Marsha questions how, according to this answer, Hillel was permitted to teach him Torah at that point if he wasn't converted yet. Because, and it's an interesting question actually, because, and this is actually a question that has to do with how much Torah can we actually teach people in the process, right? So, it's brought in the Masechah Sanhedrin, Daf Nun Tes Amud Aleph, that, Goy learns Torah is Chayav Misa. Just like a Goy keeps Shabbos is Chayav Misa, liable to death. So how could Hillel teach him Torah at that point? So the Maharsha says that once a person has begun the process of Gerus, it's permitted to teach him Torah to help him achieve the goal. And this actually forms the basis for the fact that we could teach Torah to conversion candidates, even if they're still halachically Gentiles. But anyhow, he only converted him after this incident when he knew that a ger is forbidden to become part of the kahuna, part of the priesthood. Doesn't mean that he actually was Magayer him at the time, but rather that he accepted to convert him. And beautiful teaching that from an insincere motivation can come a sincere one, from insincere intentions ultimately acted based on sincere intentions. So according to the Maharsha, the reason why the conversion was permitted is that Hillel only converted him after he realized that he could not actually become the Kohen Gadol, and the ulterior motive no longer existed. However, the answer of the Maharsha is difficult to reconcile with the language of the Gemara, because the term Gaire, he converted him, it doesn't seem to mean that Hillel simply accepted him as a candidate for future Gerus, but rather that he converted him at the time. The possible explanation that we'll look at is given by Tosfos, who understands that in the final case, Hillel was certain that the individuals who approached him would ultimately be Magayer for the right reasons. Right, so Rashi said that he relied on his own wisdom, and it also seems to me maybe that Hillel was certain about the outcome of the Gerus. And maybe that same principle can be applied to the first two cases that we discussed as well. So let's look in Tosfos. So Tosfos here says we accept those who strive to be makabers, to be a Magayer. We accept those who strive to convert. So so the Re says this is when they persuade him to convert or accept immediately. However, if they strive to convert, we should accept them. For we find that Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov were punished for not accepting Timnah, who came to convert. Right? Case of Timnah should be a warning maybe to us in the conversion game. That's so Timnah, what happened with her? So they rejected her. Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, they rejected her, and what happened? She went and became a concubine. She went and became a Pelegesh to Eliphaz ben Esav, and from her came Amalek, who afflicted Israel, and the rabbis tell us this in the Masechet Sanhedrin, Daf Tzadi Tet Amud Beit. V'gam Yoshua kibel Rachav Chazon v'nama v'chut Chamoavia. Also, Yehoshua, Joshua, of course, accepted Rachav, Rahab, who was a prostitute. And of course, Israel accepted Nama, and of course, Ruth the Moabite. Right? The case of right, the case we saw here of Hillel, who converted the man who said, "Convert me, on condition that you make me the Kohen Gadol." Um, right, and the man who said, "Convert me on condition that you teach me the entire Torah while I stand on one foot," even though they were not striving to convert. And he knew in the end that they would be total sincere converts, like what happened in the end. So, according to Tosfos here, it seems that as long as the one overseeing the Gerus, seems that as long as they believe that the Ger will ultimately be sincere, the Gerus is valid. Even if it seems that a complete acceptance of the Torah, even though it seems that a true Kabbolas haMitzvos for the right reasons is lacking at that point. So this type of certainty is extremely difficult to maintain, and therefore we usually don't go by this. We usually try to have a more objective approach. And for people, for Rabbanim that are doing this, it's a very difficult balancing act because, again, the needs of the Jewish people, the needs of families, many competing needs have to be balanced one against the other. And I would say that rabbis need a lot of help. We need a lot of divine assistance, siyata deshmaya, divine assistance, as I like to call it, heavenly help. We're not infallible, right? In Judaism, the certificates I have on my wall basically are just an indication that I passed tests and that I'm competent to function in a professional capacity. Nobody laid hands on my head and said, you have the power to heal the sick and bring the dead back to life and, turn water to wine. Doesn't work that way in Judaism. So we need divine assistance. We need your help. We need your prayer. Beautiful prayer that I like, by the way, is Achilul Lakel on the Narayan and Rei and Pifiot that comes after. The congregation is basically praying for the Shluchei Zibur, for the Chazanim, for the Rabbanim, for those that are in positions of leading the Jewish people. Also, the Mishaberach we make every Shabbat morning. We daven, Zochei Zibur Be'emunah. Those that are Osek B'Zochei Zibur Be'emunah. Those that are involved in, those that are involved in leading the community. That we need divine assistance. And the last source we're going to look at is the Shach in Yeridea Reish Samechet Chaf Gimel, who applies this idea of Tosfos to include the idea that the Bezdin, the Rabbanim that are involved in arranging the conversion, they are the final arbiter with regard to deciding whether the ger is sincere and the conversion is valid. So there is just a need for that judgment and that siyata d'shmaya. בטוח היה בסופו לעשות לשם שמיים קרא, מכאן יש ללמוד יכול לפי חיות עיני בית דין. Right, those last words are crucial. יכול לפי חיות עיני בית דין. Everything is dependent upon the judgment of the Beit Din. So we pray that HaKadosh Baruch will give us good judgment, that we be matzliach, that we have good success, and we pray that everybody have a good week as we continue working towards Matan Torah, and the Eibishter should give everybody who needs refuah shlema, a refuah shlema b'karov, complete healing, mind, body, soul, and spirit. Rabban Shalom should give everybody who needs parnasa and and you should remember Hashem Yitbarach Tamido Chavoti. that HaKadosh Baruch Hu loves each one of us very, very much, and we should go into the week with all good news and good tidings.